The day they were cast out, the sky over the town of Providence was the color of a fresh bruise. Ilara stood before the blacksmith's forge, the heat of it a bitter memory of the life she was leaving. Her husband, Thomas, was 3 weeks in the ground, and his brother Gideon, a man built of the same iron he hammered, held the will in his thick fist. He did not read it with sorrow, but with the flat finality of a judge passing sentence. The forge, the house, the small savings, it all went to Gideon, as was his right, as the only male heir with 2 strong hands. For Ilara and her father, Silas, there was a provision. A gesture of Christian charity, Gideon called it, though his eyes held no charity at all. He pressed a small, clinking leather pouch into her hand, $20, and a folded, brittle deed. "It's the old quarry," Gideon said, his voice loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "Up in the West Canyon, the Scar they call it. Your husband always had a fool's sentiment for that worthless patch of rock. Now it's yours." A murmur went through the small crowd. The Scar. It was a place of ill omen, a collapsed and abandoned pit on the side of the mountain, known for the ceaseless wind that howled through its jagged teeth. It was a place where nothing grew, a wound in the earth that had never healed. To give it as an inheritance was an act of profound public mockery. It was a sentence of slow failure, a dismissal from the warm circle of community into the cold, indifferent wilderness. Ilara looked at her father. Silas stood beside her, his hand resting on her arm. His eyes, clouded by cataracts to a milky white, saw nothing of the sneers or the pitying glances. But he could hear. He heard the finality in Gideon's voice, the shuffle of feet as people turned away, eager to get on with their day now that the sad spectacle was over. He had been a stonemason in his youth, a man who could read a mountain's face like a book. Now he was just a blind old man, a burden. That's how Gideon saw him. That's how the town saw him. She clutched the deed in one hand and the coins in the other, her entire inheritance, $20 and a pile of useless rock. Mr. Finch from the Mercantile stepped forward, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "Now, Ilara," he began, his tone condescending, "a smart woman would take that money and buy a ticket on the eastbound stage. Go back to your people. There's nothing for you and your father here but hardship." His advice was sensible. It was what everyone expected. They expected her to break, to weep, to accept the charity of a train ticket that would take her and her problem away forever. They saw a grieving widow, barely 24 years old, saddled with a blind parent. They saw an inevitable tragedy. They did not see the spark that Gideon's cruelty had ignited. It was a cold, hard ember of refusal burning deep in her gut. She would not run. She would not be their sad story told over winter fires. Without a word, she turned from Mr. Finch and walked into his store. The bell above the door chimed a hollow little sound. The whispers followed her in. She walked past the bolts of calico, the barrels of flour, and the jars of candy. She went to the back wall where the tools hung, dark and silent. She laid her coins on the counter. "I need a good felling axe," she said, her voice clear and steady, "a shovel, 50 feet of rope, and a bag of salt." Mr. Finch stared at the coins, then at her. He started to speak, to offer more advice, but something in her eyes stopped him. It was not the wildness of grief. It was the calm, chilling focus of a decision already made. He weighed out the salt, took the tools from the wall, and counted her money. She had less than $1 left when it was done. She did not look back at the forge or the house where she had been a wife. She did not look at the faces of the people who had judged her and found her wanting. She put her arm through her father's, placed the handle of the shovel in his steady hand, and with the axe and rope slung over her own shoulder, she led him west, out of the town of Providence, and toward the worthless land that was now their only home. The journey to the Scar was a 2-mile ascent into the canyon, a path that was little more than a goat track, winding through scree and stunted pine. The weight of the axe was a biting pain in her shoulder, a constant reminder of the impossible task ahead. With every step, the sounds of the town, the ring of Gideon's hammer, the rattle of wagon wheels, faded, replaced by the rising voice of the wind. Silas walked with a slow, deliberate surety that belied his blindness. He held the shovel like a walking staff, feeling the texture of the ground through the wood. He did not speak of his grief for Thomas or his anger at Gideon. He saved his breath for the climb. "The air is thinner here," he said once, his voice raspy. "The mountain breathes differently." Ilara just nodded, her own breath coming in ragged bursts. They arrived as the sun began to dip below the far ridge, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and purple. The scar was worse than the stories. It was a great, gray amphitheater of broken rock, a semicircle gouged from the mountainside where men had once blasted for granite. The floor was a treacherous sea of shattered stones, from the size of a fist to the size of a carriage. At the back, a sheer cliff face rose 100 feet, fractured and bleak. The wind, funneled by the canyon walls, ripped through the quarry with a mournful, incessant shriek. It was a place of profound desolation. Ilara dropped the tools to the ground, the clang of metal on rock echoing in the sudden quiet as the wind paused for breath. This was it. This was her inheritance, a rock graveyard. Mr. Finch was right. Gideon was right. The whole town was right. A wave of despair so cold and so heavy washed over her that her knees buckled. She sank onto a large, flat stone, the sharp edges pressing into her legs. Tears she had refused to shed in town now burned hot in her eyes. It was hopeless. They would die here. Silas stood perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to something she could not hear. He shuffled forward, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, until he reached the sheer back wall of the quarry. He placed his palms flat against the stone, his fingers splayed wide. He stood that way for a full minute, silent and motionless, a stark figure against the darkening rock. Ilara watched him, her own despair momentarily forgotten, replaced by curiosity. "What is it, Father?" she asked, her voice small. He didn't answer immediately. He pressed his cheek against the stone, then ran his hands over its surface, his touch both firm and gentle, like a man greeting an old friend. His fingers, gnarled from a lifetime of working with stone, traced invisible lines and felt for textures she could not see. "Come here, daughter," he said, his voice different now. The weariness was gone, replaced by a low, resonant excitement. "Place your hand here." Ilara pushed herself to her feet and went to him. She placed her palm next to his on the cold, rough surface of the cliff. It felt like any other rock. Cold. Dead. "I don't feel anything," she said. "No, not here," he instructed, guiding her hand a few feet to the left, to a section of rock that looked no different from the rest. "Here, close your eyes. Just feel." She did as he asked. At first there was only the rough texture, but then, slowly, she felt it. A subtle, deep, and utterly unmistakable warmth. It was not the fleeting warmth of trapped sunlight. It was a steady, living heat that seemed to emanate from the very core of the mountain. It was like pressing her hand against the flank of a great sleeping animal. Her eyes snapped open. "It's warm," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Aye," Silas breathed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Geothermal, a hot spring deep inside the mountain, bleeding its heat into the stone. This rock is alive." He tapped his knuckles against the cliff face. "And listen." He pointed upwards towards a dark, narrow fissure that snaked its way up the cliff. "You hear that? The wind howls everywhere else in this pit, but here, right here, it's just a whisper, a draft. It's pulling air up, like a chimney." In that moment the world shifted. The scar was no longer a grave. The howling wind was not an enemy, but a tool. The sheer cliff was not a wall, but a hearth. The worthless, broken land held a secret, a hidden gift of impossible value. Despair did not simply vanish, it was burned away by the slow, steady heat rising from the stone. Elara looked at the pile of shattered rock around them, then at the axe and shovel at her feet. It was not a graveyard, it was a lumber yard, it was a foundation, it was a beginning. Their first shelter was a crude thing, a lean-to of fallen pine branches, and their travel-worn quilt propped against the warm rock face. It did little to stop the wind, and the nights were a shivering misery, but the steady heat radiating from the stone behind them was the difference between survival and death. It was a constant, miraculous promise of what could be. The real work began at dawn. The quarry floor was a chaotic jumble of granite, the refuse of a forgotten industry. Elara's first task was to clear a space, to impose a small patch of order on the wildness. She took up the shovel, its new wood smooth and unfamiliar in her hands. The rock was heavy, the work brutal. By noon, her palms were raw, and by dusk, the first blisters had broken, leaving angry red welts. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed in protest. She hauled the smaller stones to the edges of the quarry, creating a low, rough wall that served as a meager windbreak. Silas, unable to do the heavy lifting, became the architect. He would sit on a boulder, his face turned towards the work, and listen. He could hear the ring of the shovel against different kinds of rock, the scrape of granite on granite. "Not that one, Elara," he'd call out. "It has a flaw. Hear the hollow sound it makes? It will crack in the first frost. Find the ones that sing with a clear high note." He taught her to see the stone with her ears and hands. She would bring him rocks, and he would run his fingers over them, feeling for the grain, for hairline fractures, for the crystalline structure that spoke of strength. He was teaching her his old language. Days bled into weeks. Elara's hands hardened, the blisters replaced by thick calluses. Her body, once soft, grew lean and sinewy. The work was a relentless rhythm of lifting, hauling, and stacking. She cleared a 20-foot square space in front of the warm rock face. This would be their home. Using the largest, flattest stone Silas had approved, she began to lay the foundation. She found a vein of rich clay near a seep at the far end of the quarry, and she mixed it with sand and water to create a crude but effective mortar. The walls rose with agonizing slowness. It was a monumental task for one person. She felled slender pines from the canyon's edge, stripping their branches and using the trunks as support beams for the roof. Lifting them into place was a battle of leverage and sheer will, her muscles trembling with the strain. Silas would guide her with his voice. "A little more to the left, girl. Feel the balance of it before you set it down. Let the stone do the work." She built the fireplace first, directly against the warmest part of the geothermal rock. It was Silas's masterpiece. He designed it not just to hold a fire, but to absorb and radiate its heat for hours. The back wall of the fireplace was the mountain itself. The heat from the flames would pour into the already warm granite, turning the entire cliff face into a massive, slow-release hearth. For the chimney, she carefully widened the fissure Silas had found, lining it with smaller, flat stones mortared with clay. It drew the smoke upwards perfectly, venting it 100 feet up the cliff face, where it dissipated, almost invisibly, into the wind. While she built, she also established their other systems for survival. The seep that provided the clay also offered a slow, steady trickle of clean water. She dug a pit inside the footprint of their rising walls, 3 feet deep, and painstakingly lined it with a thick layer of the same clay, packing it down until it was smooth and watertight. The seep was diverted to fill it. They now had a cistern, a protected source of water that would not freeze, fed from the mountain's own veins. After a month of relentless labor, the structure was complete. It was less a cabin and more a stone fortress built into the quarry. The walls were 3 feet thick, a solid mass of interlocking granite and mortar. The roof was a combination of heavy logs covered with layers of pine boughs and sealed with a final thick coat of clay. The door was a heavy, rough-hewn slab of pine that swung on leather hinges. It was not beautiful, but it was solid. It was real. The first night they lit a fire in the new hearth was a moment of quiet, profound triumph. Outside, the autumn wind howled its usual lament. Inside, for the first time, there was only the gentle crackle of burning pine and an enveloping, bone-deep warmth. The stone walls drank in the heat, and the great rock face behind them radiated a gentle, constant comfort. Silas sat on a stool Ilara had made, his hands outstretched not to the fire, but to the warm back wall. "We did it, girl," he whispered, a tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "We built a home from a hole in the ground." But a home was not enough. They needed to survive the winter. They needed more than shelter. They needed food. The next week, Ilara left her father with a pile of firewood and a full cistern, and walked the 2 miles back to Providence. Her appearance in town caused a stir. Her clothes were stained and torn, her face was smudged with dirt, and her hands were the rough, calloused hands of a laborer. She looked wild, but her eyes were clear and direct. She walked into Finch's Mercantile, ignoring the sudden silence and the stares. She went to the counter and placed 4 precious silver dollars on the wood. "I need 6 laying hens and a sack of feed," she said. Mr. Finch looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Chickens?" he scoffed, unable to hide his disbelief. "Daughter, it'll be snowing in a month. Those birds will freeze solid in that rock pile before you get a single egg." Just then Gideon walked in. He stopped short when he saw her, a smirk spreading across his face. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in. Still playing house in the rocks, Ilara? Now you want chickens to join your foolish games?" He laughed, a harsh, booming sound that filled the store. "You'll be begging for a handout at my door by Christmas, mark my words." Ilara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply waited. Her silence was more powerful than any retort. It unnerved them. Flustered, Mr. Finch took her money, crated the hens, and hefted a sack of feed onto her shoulder. She bought a young goat from a farmer on the edge of town, its bleating a lonely sound in the quiet street. The journey back was even harder. She carried the heavy sack of feed, herded the goat on a rope, and balanced the noisy crate of chickens. The sight of her, a lone woman wrestling her meager livestock up the canyon path, became the newest story in Providence. They called her the Quarry Queen, a name born of mockery and pity. They laughed about her rock-pile castle and her flock of doomed chickens. They settled in for the winter, confident in their warm, conventional log homes, and waited for her inevitable failure. They did not know about the secret of the stone. Back in the scar, Ilara built a small, secure pen for the animals in a corner of their stone house. The gentle, constant warmth that kept her and Silas from freezing did the same for the birds and the goat. And the chickens, comfortable and safe from the wind and cold, did not stop laying. Every morning, Ilara collected precious, perfect eggs. The goat provided a small but steady supply of rich milk. She also created a garden. On the quarry floor, sheltered by the low walls she had first built, she designated a patch of earth. For weeks she had hauled buckets of rich, dark soil from a grove of aspens down in the canyon, mixing it with goat manure and ash from their fire. It was a sunken garden protected from the worst of the wind and benefiting from the thermal mass of the quarry walls, which absorbed the faint autumn sun and radiated it back at night. She planted hardy greens, kale and chard, and root vegetables. They grew slowly, but they grew. As autumn deepened, a new member joined their small family. A lanky, half-starved dog with one floppy ear appeared at the edge of the quarry one evening, drawn by the smell of their cooking fire. He was wary, his ribs stark beneath his matted fur. Ilara left a bowl of goat's milk for him. He drank it greedily and disappeared. The next night, he was back. She left more food. This continued for a week, until one evening he followed her to the door of the stone house. She opened it, and he crept inside, collapsing by the hearth as if he had finally come home. She named him Scout. He became their guardian, his keen ears a constant sentinel against the wilderness. The mockery from the town faded into the background as winter closed its fist around the valley. Alara's world shrank to the rhythms of survival inside her stone sanctuary. Each day was a cycle of simple, vital tasks. Rise before dawn, tend the fire, milk the goat, collect the eggs, feed the animals, check the snares she had set for rabbits, haul water from the cistern. The routine was demanding, but it was a liturgy of life. Deep winter was a time of profound isolation. The snows came, blanketing the world in a thick, silent shroud of white. For weeks on end, they saw no one. The path to Providence was impassable. Their world was the warm, fire-lit interior of their home, the steady breathing of the animals, and the constant low hum of the wind over the roof. Outside, the temperature plummeted far below freezing. Inside, the air was always warm. The great stone wall behind the hearth was a permanent reservoir of heat, a silent beating heart for their small world. Silas thrived. The dry, steady warmth soothed the ache in his old bones. He would sit for hours, carving bits of scrap wood into small animals, his hands remembering the shapes his eyes could not see. He told Ilara stories of his youth, of the mountains he had known, of the secrets hidden in the rock. In the evenings, she would read to him from the one book she owned, her voice a soft counterpoint to the wild symphony of the storm outside. They were tested. One night, a pack of wolves, driven by hunger, found them. Scout's ferocious barking roused Ilara from her sleep. She peered through a small crack in the door and saw a dozen pairs of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. The wolves circled, snarling, but the thick stone walls were impenetrable. The heavy door held fast. They were utterly safe. The wolves eventually gave up, their howls fading into the distance. The incident was terrifying, but it was also a confirmation. What she had built was not just a shelter, it was a fortress. In town, the winter was taking its toll. It was a colder and snowier season than any could remember. The wind was relentless, peeling shingles from roofs and finding every crack and gap in the log walls of the houses. Firewood, stacked high in autumn, was dwindling at an alarming rate. The cold was a physical presence, an enemy that laid siege to every home. Gideon, for all his strength and pride, felt it too. His well-built house felt drafty. His children were always bundled in blankets, and his wife's face was etched with worry. The story of the Quarry Queen and her chickens was no longer funny. It was simply forgotten, a foolish footnote to a summer-long past. Then came the blizzard. It was not a storm. It was a physical assault, a monstrous, living thing that descended from the north. The old-timers would later call it the Great White Hurricane of '83. It began with a sky the color of lead and a wind that did not just blow, but screamed. For 3 days and 3 nights, it raged without pause. The world dissolved into a churning, blinding chaos of white. Snow fell not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that sounded like a freight train derailing. In Providence, it was a catastrophe. The conventional homes, the pride of the valley, began to fail. The sheer weight of the snow caused the roof of the meeting hall to groan and splinter. The wind, like a thief, found its way into every home, killing fires with downdrafts or sucking the heat straight up the chimneys. Snow piled in drifts that buried doors and windows, trapping families inside. Livestock, caught in their barns, began to freeze to death. The town's confidence, its very sense of order, shattered under the relentless onslaught. Panic began to set in. People were running out of firewood, their carefully stacked cords now buried under 10 feet of snow. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a killer. Gideon's house was a fortress of cold. Despite a roaring fire in the forge and another in the main hearth, the icy drafts were winning. His youngest son, Daniel, had fallen ill, his breathing shallow, and his skin burning with fever. Gideon watched his wife, Mary, pile every blanket they owned onto the small boy, but he continued to shiver. The cold in the room was a palpable thing, and it was stealing the life from his child. Desperation, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through Gideon's pride. Meanwhile, in the stone house at the Scar, the great blizzard was little more than a distant rumor. The sheer mass of the mountain absorbed the wind's fury. The howling was a muted, deep hum, the sound of a distant sea. The stone walls, 3 feet thick, did not tremble. The roof, packed with clay and pine, held fast under the immense weight of the snow. Inside, the world was an island of calm and warmth. The fire in the hearth burned with a steady, untroubled flame. The geothermal wall radiated its gentle, ceaseless heat. The animals were quiet in their pen. The cistern was full. Ilara went about her daily chores as if it were any other winter day. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. On the 3rd night of the blizzard, Gideon made a decision born of pure terror. Daniel was growing weaker. The house was an icebox. He had to do something. He remembered the mockery, the cruel jokes, the sureness of his own judgment. He remembered Ilara leading her goat up the canyon. He had called her a fool. He had sentenced her to death in that rock pile. But as his own son coughed, a weak, rattling sound in the freezing air, a desperate, impossible thought took root in his mind. What if she wasn't dead? What if her foolishness had somehow worked? It was a mad hope, but it was the only one he had. He wrapped himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned, took up a lantern that the wind would surely extinguish, and told his weeping wife he would be back. He forced his way out a back window, sinking up to his chest in the snow. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and blinding him with ice crystals. He had no path to follow, only a desperate memory of the direction of the canyon. He fought his way through the storm, a man driven by a father's fear, stumbling, falling, crawling through a white hell, chasing the ghost of a chance that the woman he had scorned was still alive. The sound that saved him was not his own shouting, which the wind tore from his lips and threw away. It was barking, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the storm's roar. Scout had heard him. Ilara was mending a tear in her father's shirt by the firelight when Scout shot to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He ran to the heavy door, barking with a frantic urgency she had never heard before. She grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire for a torch and, with her heart pounding, unbarred the door. The wind ripped it from her grasp, slamming it open against the stone wall. A blast of snow and ice filled the room, and there, framed in the swirling chaos, was a figure, a snow-caked monster that collapsed onto his knees on her threshold. It was Gideon. His face was a mask of ice, his beard frozen solid, his eyes wild with desperation and exhaustion. He crawled the last few feet into the warmth before falling face down on the stone floor, unconscious. Ilara and Scout dragged him inside, forcing the heavy door shut against the storm's fury. The sudden silence was deafening. She rolled Gideon over. For a long moment she just stared down at the man who had cast her out, who had mocked her and publicly humiliated her. He was the author of her hardship, the architect of her exile. The memory of his cruel laughter in the mercantile was as fresh as if it had happened that morning. A bitter, cold anger rose in her. She could leave him on the floor. She could let the cold he had traveled through finish its work. It would be justice. She looked over at her father. Silas had risen and was standing by the hearth, his blind eyes aimed in her direction. He said nothing. He did not need to. In the quiet warmth of the home they had built together, in the sanctuary born of rock and resilience, there was no room for that kind of justice. There was only the quiet imperative of survival and the simple, unshakable knowledge of what was right. Her choice was made. She fetched a blanket and a cup of hot broth from the pot simmering over the fire. She propped Gideon's head up and forced the warm liquid between his frozen lips. He coughed, sputtered, and his eyes fluttered open. They focused on her face, and in them she saw not arrogance or pride, but a raw, shattered plea. "My boy," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Daniel, he's sick. The house, so cold. Mary." He couldn't finish. A racking cough shook his body. Ilara didn't hesitate. The time for anger was past. Now was the time for action. She stood and began to move with a purpose that stunned him. She pulled out a small, sturdy sled she had built from scrap wood. She loaded it with dry split pine from her massive indoor stockpile, a testament to her foresight. She heated 4 of the flat stones Silas had taught her to identify, the ones that held heat the longest, and wrapped them in thick pieces of old blanket. She filled a canteen with hot broth. She was preparing to go back out into the maelstrom. "What are you doing?" Gideon whispered, struggling to sit up. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice flat and resolute. "Scout can find the way back. Your son needs heat. Now." She whistled, and the dog came to her side, ready. She was risking her own life, her own carefully managed safety, for the family of the man who had wished for her failure. The journey back to Providence was a waking nightmare. Ilara led the way, following Scout, who moved through the blizzard with an animal's instinct. She kept one hand on the sled, the other on Gideon, who stumbled behind her, his strength failing. The wind was a physical enemy, pushing and clawing at them. But Ilara leaned into it, her face set, her body fueled by a will that the storm could not break. When they finally burst through the door of Gideon's house, it was like entering a tomb. Mary was huddled over Daniel, weeping, her own body shivering violently. The fire was nothing but dying embers. The cold was absolute. Without a word, Ilara went to work. She placed the hot stones around the child, piling the blankets on top of them. She used her own tinder and skill to revive the fire, feeding it the dry wood she had brought. Slowly, miraculously, a pocket of warmth began to grow in the frozen room. She coaxed Daniel to drink some of the hot broth. Hours later, the child's breathing was easier. The fever had not broken, but the shivering had stopped. He was sleeping. Mary looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and shame. Then she looked around her own home, the fine log walls, the glass windows, the sturdy furniture, and saw it for what it was, a beautiful, useless failure. "We have to get them out of here," Ilara said to Gideon. "This house won't hold the warmth. The storm isn't letting up. We go back to my home, all of you." The return to the scar was an exodus. Gideon, his strength partially returned, carried his son. Ilara helped Mary, who was weak with cold and fear. When they finally stumbled through the door of the stone house, the shock on the faces of Gideon and his wife was profound. The door closed, and the screaming of the wind vanished, replaced by a deep, peaceful quiet. The first thing that hit them was the warmth. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a desperate fire. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the very air, from the stones, from the earth beneath their feet. Mary's eyes widened. She stared at the back wall of the house, a solid, living cliff face of granite, glowing in the firelight. She saw the neat stack of firewood that reached the ceiling. She saw the stone cistern, full of clear water. Through a partition, she heard the soft clucking of chickens and the bleating of a goat. In the corner, under a small covered opening in the roof that let in a sliver of gray light, she saw a small patch of impossible green, a row of kale, vibrant and alive in the dead of winter. She looked from the impossible garden to the sleeping animals, from the mountain of firewood to the calm, blind face of Silas, who sat carving by the fire. She looked at Ilara, who was quietly adding more wood to the hearth. This was not the hovel of a madwoman. This was not a grave. It was a haven. It was a masterpiece of survival, built by the very person they had dismissed and cast out. Gideon stood in the center of the room, his sick son cradled in his arms, and simply stared. He, the town's master builder, the man of iron and wood, had built a beautiful icebox. Alara, the grieving widow with nothing, had built an ark. He finally understood. She hadn't just found shelter, she had harnessed the mountain itself. He walked over to where Ilara stood by the fire and stopped before her. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the storm and his own failure. All that was left was a raw, painful humility. "I called this place Silas's Folly," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I told everyone you were digging your own grave." He looked around the warm, life-filled room, and a dry, humorless laugh escaped him. "My God, Ilara, we were the fools. I was the fool." Ilara looked at him, her expression calm. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." Her victory was not in his defeat, but in the sleeping child in his arms, in the steady warmth of the room, in the simple fact that they were all alive. She had no need for his apology, but she saw the sincerity of it. She simply nodded and gestured to a space near the warm stone wall. "There is soup on the fire," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Bring your son over here. The stone is warmest here. Let him rest." Her grace was more humbling than any accusation could have been. She offered them food, shelter, and warmth, not as a transaction, but as a simple act of human decency. She treated them not as enemies who had wronged her, but as people in need. In that moment, Gideon knew he was not just in the presence of a clever builder, but of a strength of character he had never imagined. He had been powerful. She was strong. He had never understood the difference until now. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was reborn in a pristine, silent blanket of white. The sun shone on a valley transformed. From the quarry they could see the town of Providence below, half buried, smoke rising weakly from only a few chimneys. The news of Gideon's rescue and the survival of his family spread as soon as paths could be cleared. It was a story told first in whispers of disbelief, then in shouts of wonder. People began the arduous journey up the canyon, not to pity or mock, but to see. They came with offerings, a sack of flour, a cured ham, a bolt of wool, and with questions. They stepped from the blindingly white frozen world into the warm earthen reality of Ilara's home, and they fell silent. They saw the systems, the elegant simplicity of the geothermal hearth, the internal cistern, the winter garden. They touched the warm stone wall with their own hands and shook their heads in amazement. The name Quarry Queen was retired, spoken only with a sense of deep irony and shame. They started calling her home the Hearthstone, or simply Silas's Gift. Gideon, true to his word, became her greatest advocate. He told everyone of his folly and her wisdom. He brought men from the town to study her work, to understand the principles she and her father had employed. The great blizzard of '83 changed the town of Providence forever. The following spring, new structures were built differently. People began to incorporate massive stone hearths into their homes. They built stone foundations deep into the hillsides, seeking the earth's stable temperatures. The lessons learned in the Hearthstone became the new architectural wisdom of the valley. Ilara's home was no longer a strange anomaly. It was the model for a more resilient future. Her story traveled with merchants and trappers to other settlements, a frontier legend of the woman who built a home warmer than any in the valley from a place no one wanted. Ilara never sought recognition or power. She continued her quiet life in the quarry, expanding her gardens, trading her surplus eggs and goat cheese for things she needed from town. Her relationship with the community was transformed. They no longer saw her with pity, but with a deep and abiding respect. She was not just a survivor. She was a founder, a pioneer of a different kind of thinking. Years passed. Silas lived out his final days in the steady, gentle warmth of the home he had designed with his mind, and she had built with her hands. He died peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting against the warm stone wall. Ilara buried him on the ridge overlooking the quarry, in a place where he could forever feel the mountain winds. She lived on for many decades, a quiet, formidable presence in the valley. The stone house stood immutable, a testament to her labor. The sunken gardens flourished, turning the once barren scar into a terraced oasis of green. She had arrived with nothing but a worthless deed and a father the world considered a burden. From those discarded things, she had built not just a shelter, but a life of dignity, independence, and quiet strength. Her legacy was not written in books, but in the very stones of the valley, a quiet lesson that the greatest value is often hidden in the places others have thrown away, and that the truest strength is not the power to cast others out, but the grace to welcome them in from the cold.